afternoon. Hello. Hello. Yeah. Hello. If so, good afternoon. We would like to resume our conversation. We are very fortunate to have today a panel of three experts. Their CVs are in the folder, so I will not spend a lot of time basically introducing them. We have Dr. Pronab, who is currently the country director of the International Growth Center India Central Program. We also have Dr. Shukla, who is the chief economist from Mahindra Group, and Mr. Gupta, who is from McKinsey. And what we want to do is basically to have a conversation around the topics identified in the books and a conversation with the focus on India. So we suggested three topics that the panelists can address, but of course they have the freedom to address other topics that they think are more relevant. So basically, for us, there are three questions that are important to address. The first question is, looking at the contents of the book, what are the main messages, or what is the meaning of the messages, the key messages of the book in the case of India, what it means for India. The second question is, from a private sector perspective, what are the implications of the key messages of the book, in particular with regard to the key messages again, and in what it means in terms of business strategies. And the last but not least question is what it means in terms of public policy, how these new development patterns that are described in the book means for the relationship, the public policy that the government needs to develop. And in the case of India, in particular, what are the union-level responsibilities, or what are the state-level responsibilities, and how these two should interact. So without further ado, I would like to request Dr. Sen to initiate the conversation, and you have about 10 minutes. Thank you.
I don't need that much. Because in a sense, the three issues that Sebastian raised, I think we'll come to the public policy bit at the end after we've had something to say. But first, let me compliment the authors for the book. I mean, I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I loved the cover page. I'd be just sitting here and staring at it. It's great. But let me also then say where the book actually falls short. What the book does is it talks about technology and the manner in which technology has been affecting the production processes in manufacturing. Okay? What it does not talk about is what technology has been doing to patterns of demand for manufactured products. And my submission is that there is a very strong influence playing out, and it is going to gather momentum as we go along. That's actually the fourth big dimension of industrialization 4.0. If you think about history and you think about the replacement of labor by capital, of which what we are looking at is a continuing trend, that entire process has essentially been driven by a deliberate attempt at homogenization of tastes and preferences, which then leads to standardization of production processes, which can then get automated. What information technology is doing now is actually breaking that particular pattern. How rapidly it breaks it, we don't yet know, but I think the process has begun. We are, I think, for a very large number of products, we are actually moving away from homogenization to customization. Preferences, aesthetics are now becoming more dominant than a standardized product. Now, in a situation of that kind, I can see the automation technologies being able to make a dent at up to a particular stage of production. Beyond that, when you're actually then creating the product for a specific customer, there's going to be a whole lot of interventions needed which machines will not be able to do, not because they can't, but because I think, as was rightly pointed out, machines tend to be good at a single task over and over and over again. Here, the task itself changes. Now, whether machines can do it or not, eventually they may well be able to do it, but I don't think that's going to be happening in the foreseeable future. That's number one. I think we need to keep this at the back of our minds when we think about what kind of response should we have as a country. The second issue is we need to ask ourselves the question, what is the kind of worker that these technologies will replace? The view has always been that, again, the historical process continues, which is that the least skilled worker gets displaced first. I think what I heard from the two of them is, no, that's not going to be happening. What's probably going to be happening is going to be a mid-skilled worker who's going to get displaced. So what you're going to be seeing is, instead of a process where you move from low skill to high skill, and that's a continuum, what you're going to be finding is a double peak situation where there's a demand for very high skills and possibly an increased demand for relatively low skilled, and a hollowing out in that middle. Now, that has, I think, serious implications about how we think about our education and training policies. Because if we continue the old pattern, I think we're in for a very, very rude shock. So that's the second issue I'd like to bring up. The third issue, and this is, I think, a little trickier, is that, again, for historical reasons, people have aspirations in terms of what is it that they see themselves as doing as employment. These aspirations will have to be changed. Now, changing aspirations is not easy. Today, people are willing to take up actually a very low-paid job as a shop floor worker, in these malls. So there they're getting 10, 12,000 rupees, whereas the same person who actually went out and did manual work would be getting at least 50% more. All of this is being driven by aspirations which have come from the past. And we have, I don't think most countries have done it, and we certainly haven't, tried to change these aspirations. Because to my mind, that's going to be the key to whether the technologies will lead to a sense of despondency or will actually lead to a sense of well-being. I think a lot of it is in our minds and not in the reality of lived existence. So these are the three issues that I would like to flag in terms of discussion. I'll stop here, and then I'll come in after the other two have spoken.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Those are very, very interesting points. And I would like now to offer Dr. Shukla the floor. What we are interested in particular in this case is that coming from a group which is a very diverse, complex group that, with a broad base of manufacturing activities, how do you see the future in light of these new developments? Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning, everyone. When I came here and when I heard Mary, you said you're starting with a question mark. I skipped a beat. I waited, and then when you went to the India section, you ended with 4 question marks. My heart sank. So I've come down from Mumbai to learn something more on how are we going to be creating jobs. But I think I'll be a little careful in extrapolating some of the rich world problems into the Indian experience. And as Mr. Abhishek said, I think there are more opportunities than risks. And as a large manufacturing conglomerate, we see more opportunities than risks this point in time. I think while the rest of the world has started talking about this phenomenon now, India has been dealing with this issue for, I would say, a couple of decades already. Manufacturing has somehow bypassed us. So the share of manufacturing has remained constant. The large formal sector creates just about 8-9 odd percentage of jobs. Bulk of the jobs come from the informal sector. And therefore, I think, just look at it. We report about 5%, 4.9% unemployment rate, and we still have 40% kind of poor people not really getting formal wages. We already looking at a nightmare where 50% of the wage force or the labor force contributes just about 10-11% of GDP. So I think the Indian experience has been unique. You can say, have been lucky or unlucky. We've never had a conscious growth strategy so far, and therefore never a conscious job creating strategy. And therefore, this formless kind of an adaptive economy, to me, is going to be an asset if we have the right kind of public policy support and structure going forward. The Indian experience is therefore going to be unique. We've just begun on this journey. As we speak, we probably don't even know how to capture some of these data points. We don't really know what are the employment statistics really. And therefore, when I'm looking at how do we go from here, a couple of observations. Our experience has been that there has been a capital deepening in India, which means whatever manufacturing has happened, it's actually been more capital than labor intensive. And therefore, going forward, I think as we try and move a bulk of this labor force into manufacturing or services or whatever form, so I don't really think that a bunch of experts or people can actually predict where the jobs are going to come from. But I think there are enough low-hanging fruits in India at this point in time. And if we have the right frameworks and the public policy framework, I think we'll be able to navigate this future with an Indian model of creating jobs. As far as our experience as a private sector entity is concerned, I think, let me give you just 2-3 examples. We operate in IT, which creates about, the sector creates about 4 million direct jobs and about 10 million indirect jobs. Automobiles is about 13-14 million jobs. We also operate in something called as timeshare or Mahindra holidays, where we require very low-skilled kind of people, I mean, gardener and the likes. What we observe is there is a problem in terms of quantity as well as quality. So in the IT, for example, the industry has had to contend with a 6-month to 12-month bench, right? So even though we have the likes of the IITs and the right kind of higher education institutions, we've actually struggled as an industry to find the right skill sets. So as Mr. Abhishek said, the skilling part is going to be, or reskilling is going to be really important. When it comes to the automobile or the automotive sector, we really struggle to find things like skills like welders, right? I mean, there's a huge premium. We really struggle to find people who can do those jobs for us. So while we are a labor surplus economy, I think we've had our fair share of struggle finding the right skill set. So I think if we are able to, as an economy, bring the market, the right market framework where all these come to a single place, I think we'll be able to create these new kind of jobs. The other part I want to address is the aspirational bit that you spoke about, a lot of cases we find that the mindset is no Indian parent or child really wants to dirty his hands. I mean, there is a segment of the population which really is struggling with that only white collar will do. He wants to probably sit just in front of the computer and not really do anything else. At the same time, a lot of our companies, remote locations, people are very happy if their child gets a job which pays him 10 or 15,000 rupees. So I think the aspiration bit also is a bit of a problem. So I don't really think that we can see or paint India with a single brush. I think we will have to come up with horses for courses kind of a strategy. India is not just one entity or just two entities like people call it, India versus Bharat. To us, it's more like 6 to 7 different countries with different characteristics. And if we're able to come up with strategies which can address these 6 or 7 countries within this geography, I think we'll be able to do justice to some of these.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that you as well has raised a number of very interesting points that I think that the panel will address in the next round. I would like to offer the floor to Dr. Gupta, who, as a partner in McKinsey, is also familiar with the work that McKinsey itself has been doing in this sphere. And I would like basically to ask you as well your perspective on the messages of the book, as well as on the basis of your own interaction with the private sector, as well as a consulting firm. Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. So let me just tell you where I'm going to come from. So McKinsey's own internal think tank, the McKinsey Global Institute, does a lot of work in these areas. Particularly in the last year, we've put out 2 reports on automation and the impact, including on India, and about 2 or 3 years ago on manufacturing. A bit of my work also extends into skilling as a part of McKinsey's India CSR efforts, and I also lead our industrials work. So I work with the companies that you're talking about, which create those jobs or don't create those jobs. Excellent work, Mary, Gaurav. Just building on this, maybe let me just make 3 points, and then I'll give you some backup and perspectives on those. I'll play on one side of the question. I think I'm not cautiously optimistic, but I am optimistic. And in fact, automation, which I'll come back to in a second, is probably going to be an opportunity, more an opportunity for India. And it's not to say the challenges won't be there. There's sets of things that we have to do. The Secretary talked about many of the things that are being done. And we've just heard about the kinds of things corporations are doing. But I am truly optimistic for us and our nation in being able to absorb the large number of people coming into the workforce and being able to drive growth. The second point I'll make is that while automation is important and it makes a difference of about 50 million jobs, you, Gaurav, mentioned the new way of looking at the impact of automation at the level of individual pieces of work as opposed to jobs, so roles within jobs. This is something that McKinsey Global Institute looked at first in that way, and we've looked at 1,500 roles and consequent number of activities that happen within that and what's automatable. When you apply that to India, it's 50 million jobs in a context of a 625 million job market, right? So it's a small problem where we have to bring maybe 100 million people, we absorb 100 million people who will come into the workforce, and maybe 150, and another 100 million that we should be pulling off our farms. So that's the second thing. It's a smaller problem and therefore maybe a bigger opportunity. I think the third point I'll make is that perhaps you've made a set of recommendations here on connectedness, competitiveness, and capability. I think all of those apply. I think you also raise a question around whether sectorality is right or not, or sectoral approach is right or not. I believe a sectoral approach is absolutely essential. And if not in the way of treating sectors as special sectors or strategic in nature, but in dealing with issues at a sectoral level so that they can be resolved on the ground. So these are my 3 assertions. Let me just start in the reverse order and just make a few comments on those. On the third question of, I agree with much of your book, but this last piece I would really say is very, very critical for us, and maybe we are not doing enough on that one. So, automation across the world, big issue, yes. Trade actually hasn't quite declined. So if you again look at some of our research, the flattening of trade is primarily driven off commodity prices, right? So in effect, the non-commodity price driven trade, the volume of trade in some ways, not the full volume because there's, can you hear me? Yeah. So the trade is not declining as much. And of course, there's protectionist measures that we know, and large number of them have been taken by the US and India, actually. But this is a part of a cycle. It is also true that the role of manufacturing will change, right? It will lead to productivity gains, trade, innovation, but perhaps not as much employment creation in some sectors, I should say, in probably 15 to 20% of the total manufacturing areas. The job intensity won't be as much, right? Role of services also changing, becoming much more tradable, driving innovation, right? And technology development. So in a sense, services will do to manufacturing what services will do to the world what manufacturing did to the world in the agricultural era, perhaps. And which is why I'm so optimistic, because India has the opportunity, therefore, to furrow its own path of development. I'll come back again to fresh research on this one. We've seen similar shifts before. Of course, it's happened over a longer period of time from agriculture to manufacturing. It'll happen faster. The world adjusted to those. There is going to be transition pain, but we've seen it before over 200 years. Why will we not be able to absorb this same change again? Also agree that India needs to fire on many cylinders. It can't just be manufacturing. It has to be a bunch of services. It has to be the domestic market. It has to be a bit of the export market. So fully agree with that. And then on the competitiveness issue, I think we talk a lot about ease of doing business. Do we talk enough about cost of doing business? And just take something simple as power, right? Despite all the reform that we've seen, it still costs an industry a lot to source reliable, cheap, reliable power. So fixing some of these things, and maybe perhaps as a nation, we need to focus on cost of doing business as much as we focus on ease of doing business. And then the last point on this piece I'd say is sectoral strategies are critical, particularly employment, where there is more intense employment opportunity, textiles, for example. I think we are very good at taking specific issues. Land, we'll create SEZs for land, right? We'll talk about labor, may not solve it fully, but we'll push towards labor reform as a whole. But I think it's important that we take an end-to-end view of the chain. Let's say textiles. And think about the R&D in that textile, the skilling in that textile, the land for that textile, the power for that textile, the machinery for it, the R&D for it, the market access for it, and fix the full chain. And only then, when we do it in this microeconomic manner at a firm level, only then will we get the full opportunity or for the full impact, because otherwise, roads are specific to textiles. Maybe they're not, but kind of, right? The infrastructure that you build is specific to a particular industry very often. If we build general infrastructure, there's going to be a lot of waste. If we are more targeted, we won't. So I've spent a lot of time on this point. Let me just make a couple of points on automation. Our view is that 60% of all work in India, 2030, as you take 13, 14 year, 60% of the work is technologically automatable. But only 9% of it is going to be automated, right? And you look at jobs individually, because there are many steps between technological feasibility and adoption, including economic skilling, behavior change. And this I see with my clients every day, right? I mean, the big data can give them 5 to 7% productivity increase, less energy consumption. But it'll take them 18, 24 months. These are sophisticated companies. Take them that long to absorb. So that's automation. By the way, technology in the past, PC industry, it created a net 16 million jobs in the US, right? 19 million created, 3 million destroyed, net 16 million jobs. This is from the early 90s or late 80s, let's say, the personal computer when it came. 90% of the jobs are outside of the PC industry itself. So, automation by itself is going to be very similar. I think some of the panelists talked about that. Many implications we need. There are certain kinds of jobs, there are different kinds of jobs that we will have to look forward to. Therefore, skilling will have to be different. Maybe last point on why I'm so optimistic with India, because if we look at, this is again upcoming research from MGI, you'll see it in a few months, a few weeks maybe even. If you look at emerging economies over the last 50 years, there's 7 economies, the East Asian tigers, including China, which started 50 years ago, 40 years ago, thereabouts. And were all down the manufacturing path. That's the path, export-led manufacturing path. If you look at the 11 that have been doing it only for 25 years or so, or 20 years, 25 years or so, India being one of them, the late emergers, so to say, much more diversified. India is the only one which is more services-led within that lot. But if we've been able to do it for 20 years, why can't we replicate it going forward? And I'm not suggesting that manufacturing won't have a role to play, but why can't we make our own path and just emerge in a very different in a very different way? If I look at the point I made in the middle about number of jobs to be created in India, I gave you some of the facts. The two big sectors, manufacturing is one of them. About 40 million odd jobs could get created in the next 10, 12 years in manufacturing. But the other big sectors, I don't know where you count construction. Is it services? Is it industry? It depends on where it's classified. There are 70 million jobs to be created in construction because we are building India. I mean, what we see of India today, 15 years from now, will be 20%. I mean, 80% of India hasn't yet got created, right? So, big sector to focus on. I don't think we are paying particular focus onto this. So, okay, if I just step back, just repeating what I was saying. Number one, I'm more than cautiously optimistic. I think India will create its own path to jobs, to development, which will be more services driven. While automation is important, there are bigger fish to fry for us. Automation is 50 million out of the 220 million odd jobs that India will create or can create in the next 13 odd years. And our approach has to have the elements we have talked about so far, but has to have a very strong sectoral element also to it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I find very, very interesting the idea of India's own path. And in that regard, if you look at and you said basically that in your view, the services are going to play a bigger role in this path. But to a large extent, there is this question of one of the biggest development, and this is something that is addressed in the book as well, is the servicification. And to a large extent, you need, in order to do servicification, you have to have a certain manufacturing base in order to, link the manufacturing and the services sector. On the other hand, for instance, and then if you look at China and how China is going to evolve, is probably move many of their manufacturing activities increasingly towards more servicification and diversify their services sector on using that base. Also, some research that took place in the US by economist Andrew Bernard look at the origin of many of the services industries today in the US, and many of them are really like a product of manufacturing. And so when you look at, and what Mary was talking about, the reduction of the size of manufacturing in the case of the US, it was because those manufacturing activities decided to a large extent to become services company and give the manufacturing to others. So in that regard, I would very much see the panel discussion on this, in this idea of India's own path and how different would be from what we would expect, according to past experience of countries. I don't know who would like to first start. Thanks.
I think the first thing that I want to say on that is just look at our journey. I mean, 70 years. If you look at the past, say, poster boys in terms of industries that created jobs for the middle class, BFSI, IT, telecom, we're not really seeing any large businesses or sectors emerge. And some of these have probably run their course. We are seeing growth rates actually dipping. I think what I'm enthused by, and as a group, what we're looking at is India is now starting its tryst in terms of how to deal with debt. I think corporates and banks are going to learn this over the next decade. This is something that enthuses us. what has happened is you can get locked into businesses, and if they don't really work, there is absolutely no exit. And this has actually been one of the biggest problems in terms of creating jobs. You've had large industrial groups or entrepreneurs who actually been thinking twice before stepping into a particular sector. I think this journey, I mean, as we evolve as an economy, where corporates, entrepreneurs, and banks learn to deal with death, I think that will give us a new kickstart in terms of generating the next wave of jobs. The other thing that we're very enthused with is the GST. I mean, can it replace some of these sectoral job creators that we saw in the past decade? We think this entire journey from informal to formal, or the formalization of this economy, I think to me is going to be a big sectoral driver. It's difficult to say this is the particular sector where jobs are going to get created. It probably is going to be difficult to say that, but there are enough low-hanging fruits. I mean, for example, just the numbers, right? I mean, we've been creating 90% of our jobs come from the informal economy. So this entire thing about, manufacturing being in trouble, I think we've probably been thinking about it for the last 2 decades now. We've been doing it in our own way in terms of through services and low-end jobs. But I think this is something that will be very, very interesting to watch out for. Urbanization. If you look at the large urban centers, I mean, we have about a dozen. There could be about 30 odd more. So roughly 50 large centers. But is that it? I mean, for a 1.3 billion economy, I think this can be a huge driver of jobs. And a lot of these jobs are typical non-tradable ones, right? I mean, plumbers and electricians, I mean, and you have a huge dearth of it, and therefore skilling. Infrastructure creation, I mean, it's really pathetic. I mean, we've made great strides in terms of infrastructure over the last, say, 15, 20 years, but there is still a lot more to do. I mean, if we're able to fix some of these are going to be pretty simple. Education, for example. Indians spend close to about $10 billion a year in the US alone. I mean, direct as well as indirect. With the kind of pool we have in terms of the higher education, the profs and the IITs and the managements, IIMs, I think this can well become a sector where we can become a magnet for some of the lower middle class people from other countries. I mean, if we have a concerted policy over there, we can probably create a lot more jobs. Healthcare, right? Empathy is something robots can't do as of now. I mean, they might eventually do, but for an IV, you would probably require a human being. And therefore, another sector where we have a huge potential, I mean, if we are able to do it right. So I think there is no real dearth, and I can't really say that this is the Indian model, but I would just say that there are enough low-hanging fruits, and if we do it right, and it's not about speed, I would say it's about consistency. If we are consistent with a set of policies, with focus, I think we'll be able to do it.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sen?
I, by and large, agree with what Sachchidanand said, but let me just also extend it a little bit. You know, one of the things that I think we don't recognize sufficiently is that when we are talking about India, and we keep talking about these two Indias, we've never thought about rural India as essentially being a driver of industrialization for the country. We keep thinking about industrialization as something that happens when you address a global market, right? Rural India is 900 million people. So think of the industrial sector in India actually trying to address 3 markets: a global market, an Indian urban market, which is about 400 million people, and an Indian rural market, which is about 900 million people, right? If one can get the nuts and bolts sort of done properly in terms of getting incomes in rural India up, you can actually have sustained industrial growth at fairly low levels of technology for a long, long period of time. Problem is we don't think about it that way. The moment we talk about industrialization, we look at the rest of the world. I think we are actually shooting ourselves in the foot. Now, this is where Mr. Abhishek's point is right, that, who's going to address these guys? It's going to be really startups. But, Ramesh, this is where I think we make an error, is we are doing actually quite well on startups. In fact, the last couple we've been doing very well. Problem is taking them to the next step. Because most startups tend to have relatively low productivity. It's when they move to the next step that the productivity levels become meaningful. And that's the middle that we are simply not focusing in terms of our policy. We have a policy for startups, we have policy for relatively large companies, but very poor policy framework for the middle rung. And I think that's what we need to focus on. My personal view is I don't think we need to pick winners in terms of products. We need to actually think much more upon the institutional structures of our industry and where we have a policy like That's the first issue. The second issue is in terms of skilling. I'm not sure whether people are aware. In India, if you look at the labor force, only about 15% of the labor force has a job, in the sense that there is one function he or she performs for the full working day and 365 days a year. The remaining 85% are engaged in multiple occupations. All right? They are doing various things. In rural India today, on the average, over the course of a year, a person will be doing a minimum of 3.5 occupations. They're not jobs. Right? So when we think about jobs, we again need to be careful that we have a system where the workforce is used to multiple occupations. They all aspire towards a job, but they're used to multiple occupations. Now, the kind of technological development we are talking about may actually be more amenable to having people specializing in certain things and doing more than one job, rather than being full-time employed, going to the factory, turning a screwdriver, whatever it is, and coming back home. We really need to think this through, and we really haven't. And this is something we'll have to spend, I think, a fair amount of time in terms of what will be the kind of task opportunities, if you will, which will be thrown up by this new technology that's coming up. And can we actually think of giving labor, our workforce, the flexibility to do it? In India, we already have it. Rest of the world will have a bigger problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Gupta?
So back to your question of manufacturing needs a base, or services need a base of manufacturing. So at least my view is that, if you think about real estate that's used for a BPO, which is constructed, for which you need cement, for which you need roads to transport those, I think there's a certain minimum, and of course, pretty much all of cement in India is going to be made locally. And the chain itself has, while cement making itself may not be that intensive, labor intensive, but many of the other steps are like logistics and so on. So you take the chain in itself, manufacturing clearly has to be there. It's not an either or. The question is, does it have to be manufacturing led completely or not? So in that sense, to the point that the authors of the book make of, we have to fire on many cylinders, that I think is absolutely right.
Thank you.
Oops. You want to use this?
No, it's okay. Thank you very much. I think that we have now time for about 10, 15 minutes for questions from the audience. And please, if the questions can be very focused, it will benefit all of us, because then we will have more questions to ask. And so let's start with, if you can introduce yourself, please.
My name is Anand Gupta. I'm an economist. I was professor of economics at IIM Ahmedabad for many years. And I have a question for Mr. Rajat Gupta. I think what you said, if I got you correctly, the cost of doing business in India is much more important than the ease of doing business. I think extremely important point, And since you come from McKinsey, I'm sure you have quantified the cost of doing business in India. Over the last 10 years, or last 5 years, has there been any reduction in the cost of doing business in India? You mentioned, for example, the issue of cost of power, right? On that account, the cost of power has gone up, What about other costs?
So I do want to, I think ease of doing business is critically important, as is cost of doing business. So I think they need to be taken hand in hand. And it's not like the steps for this are not being taken, whether it's making an industry and supply bases more competitive, as it's happened. And if you look at, I think if I just take a 15, 20-year view, I have to say, working from inside the industry to drive change, transformation, more cost competitiveness, I think cost of doing business, or companies have certainly become more cost competitive, right? So for example, just this morning, I was with my colleagues who do a lot of work driving performance improvement in industrial companies. And one of the interesting factoids that came up was that they were doing currently 5 pieces of work with different companies, which are driving down the cost of securing power. So many of them make their own power, some of them source power from the grid. But there are some, in the Electricity Act 2003 and subsequent changes that have happened, there are some settings in there which are being made use of now, 15 years later, 14 years later, to reduce cost of power by 30%, right, in reasonably energy-intensive industries. Right? And this was a revelation to me. 5 of our teams in different sectors are doing this, right? So I think there's a lot of work that companies have done on the basis of regulations that have emerged. My point here being that as we look forward, we have to have laser-sharp focus on that. And that's how companies will become. That's one very important axis on which companies will become competitive.
Thank you. So,
Ricardo Tavares from Tech Policy. During this period of fragmentation of production, India did not take full advantage of it. So China did. But India succeeded in building an IT outsourcing industry during this period. So it's not that India lost everything. Actually, it was very successful, and this is a hard cash earning for the country industry. And if you look at all this transformation of industry, it's going in the direction of information technologies. This is an area that actually India has strength. And my question is whether the key challenge, at least in these highly tradable industries that are technology intensive, is really not a transformation of the IT industry, that India leveraged where it's winning instead of looking at what it did not do in the last 20 years.
Thank you. I think we can take a couple of more questions before answering, so thank you.
My name is Ajay Mutreja. I've been involved with scale-up of startups, and my question is to Dr. Sain. I firstly 100% agree with you that there are hardly any policy guidelines in this country to look at productivity improvements of startups or even to help in scale-up. I have another issue to talk about. I think India badly needs to look at how we can create technology-led jobs for small and medium enterprises rather than focusing on the industrial 4.0. I work a lot in the area of embedded systems, IoT, artificial intelligence, and connected cars, but I think they're not going to create jobs in this country. What's going to create jobs in this country is the areas that I have also been working through FICCI, which is looking at innovative technologies that can improve the farmer's income, innovative technologies for healthcare, medical devices, using cross-border learnings. In my last 35 years, I have been involved in 1,500 plus technology transfers to India and startups of foreign companies, and I've realized that India is still trying to reinvent the wheel rather than learn from the innovations in Sosa in Israel or in Silicon Valley or in Chengdu in China and in Seoul in South Korea and many other countries. I'm happy to talk offline on this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, yes. And then the Mr. please.
Myself, Amitabh Khuntia. I am a faculty member in VV Giri National Labour Institute, and I am involved in research and training related to skill and employment for various stakeholders. Now, I'll just supplement my that Professor asked you, and this cost competitiveness aspect. You might be knowing that we recently had 2016 this Pradhan Mantri Rozgar Protsahana Yojana, where these entrepreneurs are given a rebate on say 8.33% for this EPS and 3 rest for this EPF for new addition in the employment. So this is a new initiative, and I want to compliment our authors that in the last slides they have made us not to panic. They have used the term "don't be so." What is that? Alarmism rather than urgency. I think there is a preparedness, and you can throw light upon these areas. McKinsey, can we now predict that these initiatives of the government can have the effect on this cost effectiveness, less cost effectiveness? And my concern, I totally agree to 3 points that 3 panelists have raised. One is a sense point of view is very. I personally endorse that we have to look into these 3 areas, three global, urban, and rural perspectives while analyzing our markets. And sir, earlier we used to personally skilling and skill upgradation, skilling and upskilling. But now we definitely look into this reskilling and multi-skilling aspect because in this context, since our secretary is here, we'll definitely try to connect it with our policy that what is the percentage of job loss?
Excuse me. Okay. Sorry.
One point.
There is one person.
Last point. Sir, NSDC has projected the skill gaps, but we would, through our policy, should look into the skill losses in a very regular basis so that this reskilling and multi-skilling could be materialized or could be connected for the. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. The last question, please. Thanks so much.
My question is in the context of creating jobs in the construction sector that Mr. Gupta talked about in the later phases of his it is true that construction is providing jobs in the last 15 years or so, and it will going to provide jobs because we are building India. The question is what kind of job? Because the construction sector is almost 100% of informal sector. The conditions of work are very poor. So even though these sectors are throwing up jobs, but question is the quality of job and whether they are at all related to the goal of decent work or not. In this context, it is also another issue is that we are moving from more informalization rather than we are going back to formalization. This talk about formalizing informal sector labor is not happening at all. It is a one-way traffic. We are informalizing the formal sector also. So jobs are being created, but the quality of job is a question. We have a large number of so-called quote-unquote working poor. They get jobs, but they remain poor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your question. So I would ask the panel to address some of the questions, of all the questions, depending on which one you would like.
Well, all right. I have only one, which is on the issue of technology-led growth of the SME sector in India. I quite agree. The reason you had all this problem is because technology transfer at low scales of production simply didn't happen. I mean, the matchmaking was too expensive. But that ball game has changed. Now what you're finding is a lot of companies are actually being able to do small-to-small technology transfers, again, because of the information revolution. So hopefully this is a process that will accelerate. My concern is a different one, which is that the development of new technology for the SME sector, who is going to take that up? Earlier, it was integral to the industrialization process. Now, from what they're saying, that may actually take a back seat, in which case we have a different order of problem. And I think it's a serious source of concern. And it's something we need to work on in terms of domestic policy.
Thank you so much.
That was the only one.
Maybe let me just, I won't respond to the questions in specific, but just try and cover a couple of them. One is, to the point of quality of jobs, I fully agree with that. But, you know, we also have to take it step by step. I think construction jobs are 2 to 3 times productive relative to the farm jobs which people are coming off, right? So to that extent, the incomes are better. There's perhaps over time more stability to that income also if we have enough construction ongoing, some degree of formalization. So, I mean, it's a little bit like Aki Morita, the founder of Sony, right? I mean, if Japan hadn't embarked on just manufacturing poor quality goods in the 50s, it would not have then had a ladder to climb, right? So this is a part of our ladder. I think construction is a very important part of our ladder, just like manufacturing is part of that ladder of productivity improvement and quality of jobs improvement. I think to the other point about leveraging both India's strength on ICT and technology with regard to SMEs and even individual workers, I think we do have an extraordinary opportunity of formalization in a different way. One formalization is you work for a big corporation. The other part of the formalization is that you enter the formal sector with this kind of gig work, as it's called in the West. It's really not gig work here in India, through platforms like Uber, through other kinds of platforms. I mean, if we have proliferation of these platforms and if they succeed and then people are formalized through that, they get their necessary healthcare, they get demand, they get skilling through some of these, they get certification, they get market access. That's pretty good formalization too, and it uses a source of strength, which is ICT.
Thank you so much.
And just on that gig economy, US, it is about 1/3, right? In India, we've been living with 75% of our population in the gig economy, right? I mean, 20, 30 years. Most of the people that we know have been doing jobs like, I mean, multiple jobs in a day. And so I think this is something that we've probably learned to live with. And therefore, the things that I spoke about, GST, learning to deal with death, and this will, over a period of time, make us create those jobs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kathuria. Do you think we are ready for concluding? Thank you so much, the panelists, for joining me.
Well, I think just as all of you do, that having sat through a couple of hours of this discussion, normally when you would have come to a seminar on jobs in India and when you see figures like, you know, 1 million a month, I don't know where those numbers come from, but let's say we believe them, 1 million a month for the next decade, so 100 million in the next decade, and you're coming to a seminar on technology and robotics and displacement, at the end of it, you'd probably get a sense of going away depressed. Probably. That's what you would have sort of anticipated. But if you're like me, having kind of imbibed some of what was discussed, it'll take a while to, you know, very rich discussion to imbibe all of it. If you're like me, I go away with a sense of not cautious optimism, Mary. I agree with Rajat, my namesake, with a lot of optimism, I think. And we are a resilient, after all, we are a resilient economy. And as Dr. Sen has said, that we have, you know, dealt with informal jobs for a large part of our existence. I don't know whether it's going to be formalization of the informal sector or the informalization of the formal sector. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But one thing which has probably been discussed between the lines is if we can divorce social security or the sort of pension or social security, if we can divorce that from a job, that might be a sort of legitimate way forward for us and develop a social security architecture. And then, you know, all jobs then in some sense become formal. So you have an independent social security architecture. And this worry then about formalizing the informal sector doesn't happen, because then you have a social security. So that could be one of the way forward. And I think the government is working on that. And I agree with Mr. Abhishek also when he says that, you know, ease of doing business is perhaps one indicator, but so much more needs to be done, especially, I think, in skilling. And Dr. Sen got it absolutely right when he said, and some of our research also shows that. Radhika has left. I think she was here in the morning. And some of her research, who's working in this area in ICRIER, shows a hollowing out of the labor market as a result of demand for high skills and demand for lower-end skills. In the middle, repetitive tasks which can be performed, or at least can be kind of outsourced to capital, if you will. And that hollowing out would create demands for certain types of skills, and skilling, therefore, as Mr. Abhishek said, is extremely important. If you look at the 3-year agenda of the Niti Aayog, they also talk about that. And I think a sectoral approach, I mean, there's this big discussion between economists all the time about industrial policy versus, creating, just addressing the market failures and let the market react to that. I don't know. I mean, there is a role. Country after country has had industrial policy, and we are going to see an industrial policy, as Mr. Abhishek said. I think there could be some merit in looking at sectors like tourism, for example, medical tourism, in order to create those kind of jobs. As Sachchidanand said, that robots probably don't have empathy, and robots can't become guides, and probably unlikely to become nurses. So these are sectors which could, help India create, tide over this huge challenge, I think, that we have. And remember, we are going to become, if you look at some of the UN estimates, we're going to be the most populous country in 2030, and by 2050 we'll be home to 1.7 billion people. It's a scary thought if you're not able to provide jobs. And 900 million, the good news also is that there'll be a demographic profile which will be very advantageous. You'll have 900 million people in the age group 15 to 54, and huge numbers to be able to drive economic growth, only if we are able to provide them with productive job opportunities. So I think this is certainly, as Mr. Abhishek said, this is certainly, the World Bank's work is certainly input into what we need to do, and I think we all need to put on our thinking hats to try and address this. It's a gigantic problem, how to create jobs, and we've been dealing with it for a number of times. But I go back to the statement I made. Indians can't afford to be poor. They have to do something. And if they have to do something, let them do something productive. And I hope we can all put our thinking caps on and come up with, hopefully, solutions in the near term to this major problem that we have. Let me thank Sebastian profusely for agreeing. I think this is very important, and as a think tank, as I said, we are devoting lots of resources to the jobs and skilling and entrepreneurship research agenda. And we will be doing, on the 11th, we will be doing a roundtable around jobs on the database for jobs, and we are starting it, and we'll be doing over the course of 3 years, we'll be doing many such roundtables and eventually come out with policy. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on this research agenda, and I really thank World Bank and Sebastian and Junaid in absentia for agreeing to collaborate with ICRIER. And of course, thank you, Mr. Abhishek, for coming here and talking about what the government is going to do. Wish you all the best in terms of your industrial policy. And of course, Dr. Sen, old friend of ICRIER. I don't know how many of you know Pronab Sen used to work in ICRIER. I don't know whether it was his first.
My first job, it was ICRIER's first.
Dr. Sen is an old ICRIER researcher, and always the pleasure to have him here and have the benefit of his comments. Rajat Gupta has been to ICRIER several times before, and we've collaborated with McKinsey as well. And Sachchidanand, it's the first time I have come to ICRIER, but I'm sure with Mahindra doing what it is doing in this area, there'll be a lot of opportunities to collaborate with you in the future. So thank you all very much for coming. It's been a really distinguished audience. Mary and Gaurav, you were both excellent, and wish you all the best. Thank you all very much. You're all, of course, invited for lunch, please.